You think you can challenge me?
Get your
They
hands
mocked
off
her
me.
over a broken rifle,
Stop
then
it right
she hit
now.
a flying target no one dared attempt. The morning air at Camp Archer was colder than
disobeyed a
usual,
direct
sharp
order.
enough to
Men
sting the
died
lungs.
because of you.
Recruits
They died
stood in a
because of
rough
your
formation
incompetence,
across the
not
open
mine.
training field.
Get your finger out of my
Boots
face.
grinding against damp dirt, rifles slung lazily across their chests. It should have been a routine drill. Instead, all eyes were locked on a single moment, ugly,
move in now.
loud, and strangely ceremonial. Sergeant Hale, a hulking slab of muscle and temper, had one
You're not
fist
going
clenched on the
anywhere.
collar of a young
Get your
woman's
hands
t-shirt.
off me.
He yanked it outward with a snap that echoed across the field. Gasps turned into laughter.
Create
A few
action.
fresh recruits whistled, shocked more by his aggression than the sight itself. Hale leaned in, breath hot with contempt. "Say it," he growled. "Admit you're weak." The woman didn't flinch. Her shirt was stretched, dirt smudges streaked across her cheekbone, and a broken rifle hung from her shoulder, its bolt jammed, magazine dented, as useless as a hunk of scrap metal. But she kept her gaze level, steady, almost calm. That silence irritated Hale more than any backtalk could have. Behind them, a knot of recruits erupted into louder jeers. "Come on, just give up already. She can't even fix a rifle. Why is she even here?" The field felt like an arena built for humiliation. Birds scattered from the tree line. A stray breeze carried dust across her boots. She didn't say a word. Instead, she slid her fingers along the bent rifle strap, one smooth, deliberate motion, almost ritualistic. A tiny reminder that she still had control over something, even if they thought she had none. What none of them noticed were the details that mattered. Her stance subtly squared, weight balanced, hands moving with a quiet precision that didn't match a helpless recruit. It was the kind of composure that people assumed was arrogance, until the day they realized it wasn't. Hale shoved the barrel of the jammed weapon toward her. "A real soldier would have fixed this hours ago. But you?" he sneered. "You're dead weight, and everybody knows it." The crowd barked with approval. The humiliation was complete. She stood alone inside a wall of noise. Then the range officer raised a hand for silence. "Since some of you think you're experts," he said, voice cutting through the chatter, "we're switching today's evaluation. Instead of stationary targets, we're launching high-velocity drones." A murmur rolled through the ranks. He continued, "Recruits may attempt a hit if they trust their skill. But let me be clear, these drones aren't for beginners. Hit rates are below 2%. 2%. Even the confident ones shut up." Hale smirked and turned to the woman. "Perfect. Let her go first. Let's end this fast." Another round of laughter. Someone in the back muttered, "She won't even fire a shot." Another added, "Bet she drops the rifle." But she didn't move like someone facing a public execution. She stepped forward, slow, controlled. Dust lifted around her boots with each step. Her broken rifle swung lightly against her chest. The recruits parted instinctively, still mocking her, but leaving a strange corridor of silence as she walked. At the firing line, she paused, adjusted the twisted strap, wiped a smear of dirt from her cheek with 2 fingers. Then she lifted the useless rifle, examined it, and did something no one expected. She began fixing it. Not fumbling, not guessing. Each movement was precise, exact, the kind you only learn after thousands of repetitions. One of the older corporals, watching from the sideline, narrowed his eyes. Something about the way she checked the chamber, the way she tapped the bolt carrier, the way she measured the weapon's weight. It felt familiar, too familiar. The drone launcher whirred behind her. "Shooter ready?" the range officer asked. She didn't answer. She simply racked the rifle clean, fast, flawless, like it had never been broken at all. The jeering stopped. A drone shot upward in a violent burst of motion, slicing across the sky in a zigzag pattern. Even seasoned shooters struggled with that trajectory. She lifted the rifle, breath steady, not a tremor, not a hesitation, not a doubt. One shot cracked across the field, and the drone, moving at 40 miles per hour, detonated midair, erupting into a bright puff of shattered metal and smoke. For a long moment, no one could process what they'd just seen. Someone whispered, "No way." Someone else stopped breathing. Even Sergeant Hale stumbled a step backward. She lowered the rifle, calm as ever, and walked off the line without looking at a single stunned face behind her. The humiliation was over. But the fear? That was just beginning. The field stayed frozen for several long seconds as drifting smoke from the shattered drone curled upward and vanished into the gray morning sky, leaving an eerie quiet that swallowed every lingering laugh and turned the entire platoon into stiff silhouettes, staring at the woman they had mocked moments earlier. Sergeant Hale's jaw tightened as he tried to force some kind of reaction to reclaim control, yet the shock in his eyes betrayed the truth that he had not expected anything close to what she had just done, and now he struggled to understand how someone he had dismissed so violently could move with the calm precision of a seasoned marksman. The recruits behind him shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado evaporating as they whispered among themselves, each voice softer than the last, because saying anything too loudly risked acknowledging that they had misjudged her completely and now didn't know what else she might be capable of. The woman, however, didn't bask in their stunned silence or even glance back at the faces that had ridiculed her only minutes earlier. Instead, she simply walked toward the equipment rack with the rifle tucked under her arm, moving with that same quiet control that felt more unnerving now that everyone realized it wasn't weakness, but a discipline they didn't recognize. One of the corporals, the older one who had noticed her efficient movements earlier, stepped forward a few inches, studying her with the wary focus of someone trying to reconcile a memory that refused to surface fully because something about her stance gnawed at him like an echo of a forgotten briefing. As she reached the rack, she unloaded the rifle with fluid motions, placed the magazine gently beside it, and wiped the bolt carrier with a cloth she pulled from her pocket, performing each step with such deliberate clarity that it looked more like a ritual than a routine task. The range officer approached slowly, his voice lower and far more respectful than before, and asked her to confirm her name for the record, but she paused for a moment, meeting his eyes with a calm expression that made his question feel strangely out of place in the aftermath of what everyone had witnessed. When she finally answered, her voice was soft but steady, carrying a quiet authority that didn't match her recruit status, and even that small detail unsettled the onlookers who had grown accustomed to treating her as a convenient target for their frustrations. Sergeant Hale forced a harsh laugh, trying to reassert dominance as he barked that her single lucky shot didn't prove anything, though even he couldn't quite keep the tremor out of his voice, as he accused her of somehow cheating or benefiting from a mechanical malfunction that favored her by coincidence. The range officer cut him off, stating firmly that the drone's trajectory had been recorded and validated by the training system, leaving no room for excuses, and the fact that she had adapted to the broken rifle before firing the shot only emphasized the level of skill she displayed under pressure. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances, struggling with the sudden shift in the hierarchy of the field, because the woman who had been an easy object of ridicule only moments ago now stood in the center of an unexpected narrative they did not understand, yet instinctively feared. As murmurs spread across the formation, the older corporal finally recognized the source of his discomfort and quietly muttered, almost to himself, that he had once seen a demonstration at a joint base where a classified unit performed similar marksmanship feats using unconventional equipment, though he couldn't recall the unit's name or insignia. His words carried through the air like a faint spark landing on dry grass, and soon others leaned closer, whispering possibilities they hadn't dared entertain before, each rumor weaving into a growing tension that made the morning feel heavier than the thick clouds overhead. The woman ignored them all, choosing instead to gather the scattered cleaning tools from the platform and line them neatly along the rack, handling each item with the grounded familiarity of someone who had repeated the process countless times under conditions far harsher than this training field. As she stepped away, Sergeant Hale moved to block her path with his chest puffed out in a last attempt to reassert control. Yet when she lifted her eyes to meet his, something in her silent composure made him hesitate, the pause so brief that others might have missed it, but not her. She didn't speak, didn't break posture, didn't yield even an inch, and the sergeant felt a strange pressure building in his chest, as if the air around them had shifted, creating a gravity he couldn't name but instinctively respected. Before he could force another confrontation, the range officer called for the platoon to reset for the next drill, ordering everyone back into formation. But the usual noise of boots and chatter never returned, because every recruit now moved with quiet glances toward the woman who had overturned the morning's expectations with a single unbroken moment of precision. As the group dispersed, the older corporal lingered a little longer, watching her walk toward the far edge of the field where the pine trees framed the rising sun, and he realized with a deep, unsettling certainty that whatever her past was, it wasn't something ordinary recruits or even mid-level sergeants were equipped to understand. The field seemed strangely smaller now, the air heavier with the weight of unanswered questions, because in the span of a single shot, she had transformed from a dismissed outsider into a silent force none of them could ignore, and though no one spoke the truth aloud, every soldier present felt the same quiet unease settle into their bones. Something about her didn't add up. Something about her didn't belong. Something about her was waiting to be revealed, and the morning had only just begun. The woman drifted toward the edge of the training field where the morning light filtered through tall pines, and although she walked with the quiet composure of someone accustomed to being invisible, every movement carried a subtle sharpness that hinted at a discipline none of the recruits around her possessed. Her uniform hung a little loose around the shoulders, as if issued in a hurry, and the faded stitching near the left sleeve looked worn enough to suggest she had spent more time repairing it herself than requesting replacements, which only reinforced the assumption that she belonged among the lowest performing recruits. Several soldiers nearby whispered that her posture seemed too stiff and her gaze too detached, convincing themselves that she lacked the confidence and social ease common to most trainees, yet they never questioned why her steps were perfectly measured, or why each pivot aligned so cleanly with the terrain beneath her boots. Sergeant Hale, still simmering with wounded pride, muttered that her earlier success must have been nothing more than a fluke created by adrenaline and luck, and he clung to this explanation with an almost desperate determination, because acknowledging anything else meant accepting his own blindness. The recruits who overheard him nodded quickly, eager to restore the familiar hierarchy that placed them above her, and their agreement created a fragile illusion that the morning's events could be dismissed if they simply repeated the story enough times to drown out their lingering discomfort. Yet even as they tried to force the narrative back into place, the older corporal kept watching the woman with a cautious intensity, noting how she scanned the field with the subtle awareness of someone evaluating escape routes, vantage points, and hidden corners, habits no standard recruit should display without extensive conditioning. When she reached a small bench near the equipment shed, she removed the broken cleaning rag from her pocket and folded it twice with the kind of care usually reserved for tools of real importance, then placed it atop a crate, as though marking a personal anchor point, before turning her eyes back toward the rest of the platoon. Her gaze swept across the field slowly, pausing only briefly on each cluster of soldiers, yet the accuracy of that quiet survey felt unsettlingly methodical, as if she were cataloging their positions, strengths, weaknesses, and reactions with an instinct far deeper than ordinary curiosity. One of the younger recruits leaned toward his friend and whispered that she looked nervous or overwhelmed, misreading the steadiness in her breathing and the absence of fidgeting as signs of crippling anxiety, because none of them understood the discipline required to mask real capability behind such controlled neutrality. As the platoon regrouped for the next drill, she stepped into formation with a smoothness that made her movements seem almost rehearsed. But instead of admiring the precision, the other recruits interpreted it as awkward rigidity, failing to see the muscle memory beneath her quiet restraint. The range officer announced that the next task involved coordinated team maneuvers, stating that each squad would need to execute specific patterns under timed conditions, and murmurs rippled through the formation as soldiers shifted in anticipation, quietly confident that she would finally falter under the pressure of working with others. Sergeant Hale positioned himself directly in front of her, telling the squad that they needed to compensate for the weak link in their line, and although several soldiers snickered at the comment, the woman didn't react in the slightest, instead adjusting her stance by a fraction of an inch to align perfectly with the instructions. When the drill began, she moved with flawless timing, flowing through the maneuver like a ghost sliding between marked points. Yet the recruits around her stumbled, bumped elbows, and misread the pacing, creating a clumsy pattern that the evaluators immediately recorded as a coordination failure attributed to their supposed weakest member. Hale snapped at her again, yelling that she was throwing off the entire squad, and though even an untrained observer could see she was flawlessly synchronizing with the intended rhythm, the others believed his accusation without questioning the evidence directly in front of them. The woman kept her expression neutral, folding her breath inward and letting the noise wash over her like distant static, displaying the kind of emotional discipline associated with soldiers who had learned long ago that reacting only granted their detractors more ammunition to use against them. As the squad reset for another attempt, the older corporal's unease intensified because he recognized the pattern of her movements, the efficient turn of her shoulders, the the deliberate placement of her boots, and even the subtle way she kept her peripheral awareness calibrated to track the entire group while never looking directly at any one soldier. He had seen it once before during a classified demonstration by an elite unit whose members operated under strict anonymity, moving like shifting shadows in coordinated silence. And although he couldn't recall the unit's insignia, the memory returned with startling clarity as he watched her glide back into position. The recruits remained blind to these details, still clinging to their assumptions, because believing she was incompetent felt safer than confronting the possibility that they had misjudged someone who might possess skills beyond their understanding. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising with the even cadence of someone trained to control their pulse under stress, and as the whistle blew for another attempt, she moved again with the same measured precision, revealing glimpses of a past she never intended to expose through small, perfect fragments of muscle memory. To the squad, she looked like an awkward recruit struggling to keep up. To the corporal, she looked like a ghost from a forgotten briefing. And to herself, she looked like someone doing everything possible to remain unnoticed, despite a lifetime of instincts refusing to dull or disappear. By the time the drill concluded, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the field. And while the recruits spread rumors to reassure themselves, the corporal realized with a growing chill that the woman they all dismissed was hiding something far more complex than simple talent or luck. And the unease that settled over him was not fear of her failure, but fear of the day her true skill would no longer stay hidden. As the drills shifted from basic maneuver patterns to equipment handling exercises, the woman returned to the bench near the shed and collected a disassembled rifle placed there for training, lifting its scattered components with a gentle precision that suggested long familiarity rather than the tentative curiosity of a new recruit. The metal pieces glinted beneath the rising sun as she arranged them on a cloth, creating an orderly layout that mirrored advanced armorer habits. And although no one officially taught such meticulous sequencing at this stage of training, she performed it with the fluid ease of someone who had repeated the ritual through countless long nights in far harsher environments. Sergeant Hale, determined to reassert his authority, barked that she needed to hurry and stop pretending she understood what she was doing, yet even his aggressive tone couldn't hide the brief flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as he watched her hands move with a quiet confidence that contradicted every insult he had thrown her way. The recruits nearest to her leaned closer, whispering that she was probably guessing based on instinct or mimicking steps she had observed earlier, and they convinced themselves of this version because accepting the alternative that she possessed advanced expertise would require acknowledging how profoundly they had misjudged her from the start. She continued assembling the weapon without glancing at any of them, rotating the bolt carrier group and inspecting the firing pin with a practiced flick of her wrist, performing each motion with an unmistakable discipline that betrayed familiarity with far more complex systems than the standard infantry rifle issued at training camps. When she slid the upper receiver into place and pressed the takedown pin with careful pressure, the corporal watching from a distance felt a cold ripple of recognition because her method lacked the hesitant stop-and-check rhythm common to recruits, and instead followed the smooth, uninterrupted cadence of someone who had once been taught to maintain weapons under life or death time constraints. She ran a fingertip along the interior ridge of the chamber, testing for imperfections without needing to look, and then rotated the rifle again, checking alignment angles in a sequence so exact that it resembled a covert unit's maintenance protocol rather than anything taught at Camp Archer. The range officer approached quietly, as if drawn by the gravity surrounding her work, and he studied her movements with the suspicion of someone who sensed a discrepancy between a soldier's file and the skills demonstrated in front of him, though he refrained from asking questions he wasn't authorized to pursue. A younger recruit scoffed that she was only putting on a show to impress the evaluators, but the words sounded flimsy and unconvincing even to his own ears, especially when she completed the reassembly without a single error and locked the bolt forward with a soft metallic click that resonated across the field. She didn't celebrate the accomplishment, didn't seek approval, and didn't even acknowledge the surrounding silence growing heavier with each passing second. Instead, she performed a quick safety check, removed the magazine, inspected the chamber, and placed the rifle down with a calm, almost ceremonial finality that commanded attention without demanding it. The corporal finally stepped closer, pretending to examine another weapon on the rack, but his eyes remained fixed on her, as he noted how she maintained her awareness of the entire environment while never appearing defensive or anxious, a behavioral signature he had only witnessed in operatives trained to survive ambush scenarios. When she reached for a maintenance brush, her fingers paused briefly near a faint mark etched into the polymer grip, a mark so subtle most recruits wouldn't notice it, yet the corporal recognized the pattern instantly because it matched a coded indicator used internally among certain special units to signal prior field modifications. His breath caught for a moment as he watched her thumb brush the mark with a quiet familiarity, suggesting not only that she knew what it meant, but that she had once relied on such markings under operational conditions, a truth that would have been buried beneath classified layers far beyond the reach of Camp Archer's standard personnel. The woman moved on without lingering, aligning the cleaning brushes by size and bristle stiffness, and although the task appeared mundane to the untrained eye, the corporal saw the deeper pattern every action hinted, at a background that did not belong anywhere near a basic training field filled with inexperienced recruits and loud, insecure instructors. Sergeant Hale approached again, forcing his voice into a tone dripping with condescension as he accused her of wasting time on unnecessary details, but even he faltered slightly when she lifted her eyes and met his gaze with a calmness so controlled that it felt like a quiet threat carried without a single hostile gesture. She said nothing, merely returned to her task with the same steady breaths and focused movements, demonstrating a level of emotional discipline impossible to reconcile with his version of her as a frightened, incompetent trainee, and the doubt spreading across his face grew more visible with each second he spent trying to interpret her silence. When the range officer ordered the platoon back into formation, the woman stood immediately with her equipment neatly arranged behind her, and although the other recruits scrambled to catch up, she waited with the stillness of someone who had lived through far more demanding environments than any of them could imagine. As they marched across the field, the corporal's realization solidified into an unsettling certainty that her presence at Camp Archer was no accident, and that the layers of restraint she displayed were not symptoms of inexperience, but signs of a soldier hiding a past carefully tucked behind a veil of anonymity. The morning drills concluded shortly after, but the air remained heavy with the quiet shock created by her subtle yet undeniable mastery, leaving every soldier on the field except her aware that something extraordinary had entered their ranks without warning or explanation. And although no one dared voice it aloud, the seeds of suspicion had already taken root, waiting for the moment her true identity could no longer remain buried beneath the surface of her measured silence. When the platoon regrouped near the obstacle course for the next round of evaluations, a restless energy rippled through the trainees as they tried to reclaim the hierarchy shattered earlier, and their hurried whispers grew sharper with each retelling of the morning's events, twisting her effort into something strange and suspicious rather than admirable or impressive. Several recruits clung desperately to the idea that her earlier perfect shot must have been a one-time miracle caused by luck or distraction, and they repeated this interpretation loudly enough for others to hear, because repeating it made them feel safer in the fragile belief that the world still made sense and that she remained safely beneath them in capability. A pair of newcomers at the far end of the line laughed nervously while claiming she had probably stumbled into the right angle by accident, and they insisted that no inexperienced recruit could possibly steady a sabotaged rifle and hit a moving drone with deliberate precision unless fate had intervened at exactly the right moment. Their tone grew bolder as more soldiers joined the conversation, and soon half the platoon was reinforcing one another's denial, building a shallow narrative designed to mask their discomfort, because acknowledging the truth meant confronting the possibility that their assumptions had always been hollow and baseless. Sergeant Hale seized the opportunity to reshape the atmosphere and loudly declared that they shouldn't let one stray success distract them from the simple reality that she lacked the physical and mental fortitude needed for military life, and the recruits nodded quickly, grateful for his confidence and eager to believe whatever restored their sense of order. He continued by pointing to her smaller frame and quiet demeanor as evidence that she would inevitably fail in any physically demanding task, and the trainees around him clung to these surface-level details with a kind of desperate enthusiasm, because relying on appearances felt far easier than accepting how little they truly understood about her. The woman stood a short distance away, hearing every word but giving no sign that their comments affected her, and she kept her eyes fixed on the obstacle course ahead, studying each structure with the careful attention of someone who had traversed similar terrain in conditions far less forgiving than anything offered in training. Her silence infuriated some recruits, who interpreted her calm expression as arrogance or passive resistance, and they muttered that she thought herself superior simply because she had performed well once, though they conveniently ignored the fact that she had never spoken a word of pride or defiance. When the range officer announced that each squad would be evaluated on teamwork during the obstacle run, several soldiers exchanged amused glances and joked that any team stuck with her would automatically fail, and Hale smirked smugly as he insisted that she would freeze, hesitate, or crumble under pressure the moment physical coordination became essential. The woman stepped into position with her squad, adjusting the strap of her vest quietly while scanning the terrain, and her movements seemed almost measured in their restraint. Yet, beneath that stillness, lay a subtle readiness that the others completely misread as nervous anticipation, rather than the grounded composure of someone far more capable than they realized. As the horn sounded, the recruits surged forward with more enthusiasm than finesse, jostling one another to gain a lead. But she maintained a steady pace, several steps behind them, conserving energy while observing their flawed rhythm, and her controlled breathing remained perfectly stable as she prepared to adjust to their inevitable mistakes. When the squad reached the first wall, Hale shouted orders with unnecessary aggression, forcing everyone into chaotic positions that slowed the climb, and he barked at her to stay out of the way because she would only cause delays. But she positioned herself exactly where structural leverage required, offering minimal guidance through subtle gestures the others never recognized as helpful. Despite her silent support, the squad flailed through the obstacle with poorly distributed weight and mismatched timing. Yet Hale blamed her lack of verbal input for the breakdown, insisting loudly that she was dragging the entire group backward by refusing to contribute in a way he deemed acceptable. At the rope section, 2 recruits overextended their reach and slipped, forcing her to intervene with a swift, stabilizing grip that prevented one soldier from falling. But instead of acknowledging her quick reaction, the recruits dismissed the incident as clumsiness on her part, claiming she had moved unpredictably and disrupted their flow. Even the corporal, who had been silently analyzing her movements throughout the day, noticed the pattern forming among the platoon and felt a tight unease coiling in his chest, because the harder she tried to blend into the background, the more fiercely the others clung to their skewed perceptions of her. She climbed the rope with controlled precision, matching her breathing to each pull, and although she ascended with a practiced efficiency that should have stood out immediately, the recruits around her were too busy tripping over their own conclusions to see the truth unfolding beside them. As they moved toward the final stretch of the course, Hale shouted once again that she was slowing the pace, but the corporal finally recognized the irony in his accusation, realizing that she had been compensating for the squad's sloppy coordination for several minutes, while still maintaining perfect alignment with the intended pattern. Yet despite this, she let the insults roll off her like distant echoes carried on the wind, refusing to react or correct the narrative because the discipline that shaped her had been forged under far more hostile circumstances, where recognition meant danger and invisibility meant survival. By the time the squad stumbled across the finish line, the recruits congratulated one another while ignoring the truth of their disorganized performance, and Hale congratulated himself loudly for keeping the weak link from collapsing, completely unaware that she had stabilized the team more times than any of them would ever know. As the platoon dispersed once again, the woman wiped the sweat from her brow with a slow, deliberate gesture, then walked toward the shade of the pines, her expression unchanged, carrying herself with the quiet resilience of someone who had lived too long behind a mask others mistook for fragility. And though the recruits felt victorious in their contempt, the corporal understood that the day they realized how wrong they'd been was coming far sooner than anyone expected. When the afternoon sun climbed high enough to bleach the training field into a wavering haze, the range officer announced a final evaluation that would test each recruit's ability to adapt under pressure, and a murmur spread instantly through the platoon because everyone sensed this round would determine their standings for the entire week. Sergeant Hale stepped forward with a grin that carried the sharpness of a blade, insisting loudly that fairness required rotating equipment so no soldier could rely on familiar tools, and although his tone dripped with manufactured professionalism, the recruits instantly recognized the suggestion as a thinly veiled opportunity to orchestrate another public humiliation for the woman who had unsettled him so deeply. The range officer permitted the equipment shuffle, unaware of Hale's true motives, and the sergeant seized the moment by quietly selecting the most unreliable rifle in the entire rack. A battered piece with a misaligned sight, a sticky trigger, and a habit of jamming under even the lightest stress, then placing it carefully where he knew she would be required to pick it up. Several recruits exchanged amused glances as they realized what he had done, and instead of questioning the ethics of sabotaging a fellow trainee, they embraced the spectacle eagerly, because it allowed them to reaffirm the narrative that had comforted them all morning that she did not belong here and would inevitably fail when stripped of every advantage. The corporal noticed the subtle positioning of the faulty rifle and felt a cold ripple of frustration rise in his chest, yet he hesitated to intervene because acknowledging the sabotage would expose his growing suspicion that she possessed a background far beyond what her file suggested, and he knew better than to draw unnecessary attention to something he didn't fully understand. When the woman approached the rack to retrieve her assigned weapon, she immediately felt its unusual weight distribution and uneven balance, and although her expression did not change, she recognized the subtle indicators of deliberate tampering which she had encountered countless times in far more dangerous arenas than this dusty training field. She turned the rifle over in her hands with a slow, practiced motion, noting the faint grind of misaligned metal and the muted resistance in the trigger assembly, and she understood instantly that someone had engineered this moment specifically to watch her stumble, fail, and break beneath the weight of collective expectation. The recruits gathered behind her with a growing sense of anticipation, whispering confidently that this would be the moment her supposed competence collapsed under real pressure, and their voices carried the kind of excitement reserved for spectators at a spectacle they believed they controlled completely. Hale walked by her with exaggerated nonchalance, offering a thin smile and a muttered comment about hoping she could manage something simple. And although his words were quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability, the malice in his tone rang clear to anyone paying close attention. The woman inhaled slowly, letting the air settle deep into her lungs as she centered her weight, and in that calm moment she slipped into the mental discipline she had been forced to cultivate long before stepping onto this base, reminding herself that sabotage only mattered when fear took root, something she had learned to extinguish years before. When the range officer signaled for the evaluation to begin, she stepped onto the firing platform with deliberate steadiness, fully aware that every recruit on the field was watching her with the expectant hunger of people who wanted confirmation that their assumptions were correct. The first target sequence simulated unpredictable movement patterns designed to throw off inexperienced shooters, and several recruits struggled visibly to align their sights as the targets jerked across the field, yet the woman maintained her posture, studying the erratic pattern with the focused patience of someone accustomed to reading chaos rather than fleeing from it. When she finally raised the sabotaged rifle to her shoulder, a wave of quiet laughter drifted from the back of the formation, and she felt the collective eagerness of an entire group preparing to witness her downfall. But instead of reacting, she adjusted the grip and shifted her elbow by the exact fraction necessary to compensate for the weapon's instability. The misaligned sight forced her to calculate the offset mentally, and she lifted her chin a precise degree to account for the tilt, mapping out the corrective arc with the same instinctive clarity she once used under live fire conditions, where a single miscalculation meant the difference between survival and oblivion. Hale leaned forward with a grin as she squeezed the trigger, expecting the predictable jam, but the woman had anticipated the flaw and applied controlled pressure that compensated for the malfunction, making the rifle buck slightly without locking completely, though her shot flew wide due to the intentional mechanical sabotage. The recruits erupted into triumphant laughter at the missed target, interpreting it as evidence that her earlier success had been nothing more than blind chance, and the volume of their jeers increased as Hale announced smugly that even a miracle can't save someone twice in one day. Yet beneath their celebration, the corporal saw something they didn't: the way she corrected her posture mid-shot, compensated for the recoil, and recalibrated her aim with an efficiency no inexperienced recruit could imitate, revealing a level of adaptive instinct that contradicted the failure they so eagerly cheered. As she prepared for the second shot, she ran a thumb along the seam of the rifle's receiver, feeling for the exact tension point that caused the misfire, and her eyes narrowed slightly as she identified the flaw, not with surprise or frustration, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had overcome far worse manipulations under far higher stakes. The laughter continued behind her, spreading like wildfire across the formation. But she kept her breathing steady, and her gaze focused on the unpredictable target ahead, refusing to let their noise dictate her rhythm or undermine the discipline etched into her bones long before any of them had worn a uniform. She exhaled slowly, adjusted her stance again, and steadied the uncooperative rifle with the same calm certainty she had shown earlier, fully aware that the sabotage was designed to expose weakness, yet equally certain that it would only reveal strength once the moment unfolded completely. And as the second target sequence activated with a sudden flash of motion, the field held its breath, waiting for a collapse that would never come. The second target shot upward in a violent arc that caught several recruits off guard, and a ripple of excited anticipation moved through the formation as they leaned forward collectively, eager to witness the collapse they believed would finally confirm their long-held view that she was nothing more than an overestimated novice who had stumbled into a lucky moment earlier. The woman felt the flawed rifle tremble slightly against her shoulder as she adjusted for the instability, and although her expression remained unchanged, something subtle shifted in the air around her, as if the field itself sensed a deeper current awakening beneath the surface of her controlled composure. A faint breeze drifted across the training ground, carrying dust that glittered in the sunlight, and she inhaled slowly through her nose, allowing the world to narrow into a calm, silent corridor where noise, mockery, and expectation dissolved into nothing but distance, movement, and timing. The recruits continued whispering, certain that she was hesitating because fear had finally taken hold. Yet her pause was not hesitation, but the deliberate gathering of focus, the kind forged only through years of learning to quiet the mind when chaos demanded clarity. Sergeant Hale folded his arms with triumph settling across his features, convinced that the tension building in her shoulders signaled imminent failure, and he allowed himself to savor the moment, unaware that she had slipped into the mental stillness that separated seasoned warriors from inexperienced fighters long before he uttered his first insult. The target veered sharply to the left, then climbed with a sudden burst of acceleration, and several recruits gasped involuntarily because the pattern was notoriously unpredictable, designed specifically to break the concentration of new shooters. Yet the woman's eyes tracked it with a smooth, unbroken precision that belied her supposed inexperience. She tightened her grip by a fraction, just enough to counterbalance the rifle's uneven weight, then rolled her shoulders down in a subtle motion that shifted her center of gravity, aligning her posture with the kind of instinctive accuracy that emerged only in individuals trained to operate under the constant threat of ambush. The corporal recognized the shift instantly and felt his pulse quicken because he had seen that same physical settling before a silent locking in that heralded a level of focus almost impossible to teach through standard drills, and he realized with growing certainty that she was preparing to do something no recruit on the field could anticipate. The laughter behind her tapered into a scattered murmur as the recruits sensed a strange change in atmosphere, though few understood why the temperature suddenly felt cooler, or why their own breathing hitched as if their bodies recognized something their minds had not yet processed. She exhaled once through slightly parted lips, letting her pulse drop into a steady rhythm, and for a brief moment the world seemed to pause around her, leaving only the distant whir of the drone engine and the faint clatter of metal from the range equipment as the final pieces of her focus clicked into place. When she raised the rifle again, the movement was slower than before, deliberate and controlled, and the corporal saw the unmistakable signature of someone entering what operators called the calm zone, a narrow mental corridor where thought and action fused into a single continuous thread unbroken by fear, noise, or uncertainty. The drone zigzagged again, its path almost taunting in its unpredictability. But she followed it effortlessly, adjusting her stance with barely perceptible micro-shifts that allowed her to translate faulty equipment into workable accuracy, and the recruits watching finally fell silent without realizing they had stopped breathing. Hale's smirk faltered as he sensed something slipping out of his control, and although he tried to hold on to the narrative he had reinforced all morning, an uneasy weight settled in his stomach, warning him that the outcome he expected might not unfold as easily as he wished. The woman's finger rested lightly against the trigger, not tense or hurried, but patient and steady, communicating a confidence far too controlled to be luck, and even those who despised her felt their chests tighten with an inexplicable instinct that something significant was about to happen. A long moment passed where nothing moved except the drone slicing through the sky, and the singular focus etched across her face transformed the training field into a stage where every soldier present felt quietly compelled to watch, because some part of them sensed that the silence preceding the shot held more power than the shot itself. She aligned the flawed sight with a subtle correction, influenced not by the rifle's condition, but by her own internal calibration of trajectory, speed, and wind, and the corporal realized that her instinctive adjustments had been far too smooth to belong to someone who had joined the military without prior advanced training. The air thickened with tension as she held her aim, letting the perfect moment bloom before her with a patience that contradicted everything the recruits believed about her supposed lack of skill, and even Hale's breathing grew shallow as he tried to interpret the stillness settling around her, like a quiet mantle of authority. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not with strain, but with the clarity of someone who had walked through far darker frontiers than this open training field, and the final pieces of her posture locked into place with a precision that made the corporal whisper softly under his breath without meaning to. Nobody heard what he said, but if they had, they would have understood why he stared at her with a mixture of awe and dread, because he recognized the unmistakable posture of a professional making a decision under pressure, and no recruit should ever have known how to move like that. She squeezed the trigger with the controlled decisiveness of someone who did not shoot to impress, defend, or prove anything, but simply because the moment required resolution, and in that split second before impact, every soldier on the field felt the world tighten, waiting for the inevitable shift that would change everything they thought they knew about her. And in the breathless stillness before the shot landed, the entire platoon realized too late that they had underestimated the wrong person. The moment her finger tightened on the trigger, a sharp crack split the afternoon air with a clarity that carved through every lingering laugh, hushing the field as the flawed rifle kicked against her shoulder with a muted recoil that barely shifted her stance. The drone, darting erratically across the bright sky with mechanical confidence, shuddered mid-flight as the bullet sliced through its chassis at an angle so precise that the machine seemed to hesitate before bursting into a scattering bloom of metallic fragments that drifted downward, like embers falling from a dying fire. Every recruit on the field froze instantly, their breath catching in their throats as disbelief settled over them in a dense, suffocating wave, because none of them had expected the shot to land, let alone with such devastating accuracy despite the sabotaged weapon in her hands. The explosion was small but unmistakable, a crack of ruptured metal that echoed across the training grounds with an authority that felt older and heavier than anything a novice shooter could have produced, and the shock forced even the loudest detractors into stunned silence. Sergeant Hale's mouth hung open as he struggled to reconcile what he had just witnessed with the narrative he had been crafting all day, and his mind scrambled for possible explanations, each one collapsing before it could fully form as the reality of her precision sank into his bones like a cold weight. The recruits who had mocked her relentlessly caught themselves standing completely still, their earlier bravado dissolving as they stared at the fading remnants of the drone, and several instinctively stepped back, as if trying to physically distance themselves from the quiet force they had failed so profoundly to understand. The woman lowered the rifle with a slow, measured motion, the barrel drifting downward like a settled tide, and although she showed no sign of pride or triumph, the calmness in her expression carried a depth of certainty that made the surrounding silence stretch even longer, heavy and unbroken. The corporal felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he studied her posture, recognizing the unmistakable signature of someone who had operated under pressure that far eclipsed the stakes of a training exercise, and he realized with a quiet dread that the shot had not been luck, defiance, or desperation, it had been muscle memory. A whisper traveled through the platoon as one trainee murmured, "No way. No way she hits that with a broken rifle," and the words spread like a faint wind across the field, reaching each soldier and dying in their throats as soon as they tried to repeat it aloud, because speaking it too boldly made the truth feel too real. Hale took a step forward as if intending to accuse her again, but the moment he met her eyes steady, clear, and unafraid, he faltered, losing his voice completely as a rush of unease rippled through him, forcing him backward with the quiet recognition that he had provoked someone far outside his understanding. The range officer cleared his throat, though the sound cracked slightly from shock, and he opened his mouth to make an official note about the shot. Yet whatever words he attempted to form fell apart as he stared at the ruined drone pieces, still drifting to the ground in slow, spiraling arcs. For several long seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and nobody dared look away from her, because the field had become a frozen tableau built around a single realization: the woman they had dismissed, sabotaged, and ridiculed, possessed a level of precision none of them could dream of reaching. She stepped away from the platform with quiet steps that felt strangely louder than the earlier shot, each footfall pressing into the dirt with a deliberate calm that contrasted sharply with the frantic pounding of the recruits' hearts. And the silence that followed her path seemed to trail behind like a shadow refusing to break. One recruit swallowed hard and whispered that no normal trainee would ever compensate for a misaligned sight with that kind of instinct, and another muttered that even seasoned shooters struggled to hit drones without wind interference. Yet she had done it under sabotage and scrutiny, as if she were merely brushing dust from her sleeve. The corporal finally stepped toward the range officer and said quietly that the rifle should be inspected immediately, and although his voice remained steady, his eyes carried the weight of suspicion that had been growing inside him all day, a suspicion now solidified into an unavoidable truth he could no longer ignore. Hale attempted to reclaim control by shouting that the drone must have malfunctioned in mid-flight, but his words trembled, and even the recruits closest to him heard the hollow uncertainty behind the accusation, making it clear that he no longer believed his own voice. The woman paused only once, glancing toward the tree line where the late afternoon light slanted in long shadows, and for a fleeting moment, the corporal swore he saw something shift in her eyes, something like recognition, familiarity, or perhaps a hint of memory tied to a world they knew nothing about. She resumed walking, leaving the devastated recruits behind as the range officer knelt beside the spent rifle with a frown growing deeper by the second, and when he discovered the deliberate sabotage hidden in its alignment, his expression changed from confusion to stunned disbelief. A heavy silence washed over the field once more, thicker than before, as every soldier felt the unspoken truth settle like a stone in their chest. If she could land a perfect shot with a sabotaged weapon, then whatever she was, whoever she had been, was not something training manuals could explain. And for the first time since morning, the platoon no longer saw her as a weak link or an easy target, but as a mystery walking in their midst, one they were no longer certain they had the right to underestimate. The range officer had barely finished examining the sabotaged rifle when the final evaluation alarm sounded across the training field, signaling the release of the highest-speed drone in the program, a target so notoriously difficult that even seasoned instructors rarely attempted to engage it under demonstration conditions. A ripple of unease spread through the platoon as the metal launcher adjusted its angle and locked into a position reserved for advanced exercises, and for a moment every recruit seemed to forget how to breathe because they all knew exactly what this particular drone represented: an almost impossible mark that demanded perfect timing, unshakable control, and a level of instinct no one at Camp Archer was expected to possess. Sergeant Hale recovered just enough of his voice to bark that she would obviously be excused from this final round due to her equipment complications, but the range officer, now visibly shaken by the sabotage he had uncovered, stated firmly that the decision belonged to her alone, and the field fell into a tense silence as she slowly turned to face the launching station. Her eyes tracked the machine without hesitation, as if she recognized its shape, rhythm, and mechanics from a life far removed from this open training base, and the recruits felt a strange chill settle over them when she stepped forward with the calm certainty of someone accepting a responsibility rather than chasing a challenge. Hale shouted again that attempting such a target was reckless for any trainee, yet the words faltered when she lifted the rifle still flawed, still imbalanced, still carrying the evidence of sabotage, and settled it against her shoulder with the effortless familiarity of a veteran stepping back into a forgotten role. The corporal watched her with a sinking realization that the distance between her and the rest of the platoon was far greater than anyone understood, and he found himself wondering whether she had once stood on a field not unlike this one, surrounded by people who also underestimated the quiet force behind her steady eyes. The drone launched with a ferocious burst of propulsion, streaking into the sky in a jagged, unpredictable path that twisted through sunlight and shadow like a living thing trying to evade a predator, and several recruits gasped aloud because the target moved with a speed far beyond anything they had encountered earlier. She inhaled once, letting the breath fill her chest with a grounded calm, then exhaled slowly as the edges of her surroundings faded into stillness, leaving only the darting shape of the drone, the tremble of the flawed rifle in her hands, and the faint pulse in her fingertips guiding her toward the perfect moment. Her stance lowered by a fraction, aligning her body with a precision that didn't belong to a recruit but to someone who had learned long ago how to shape her silhouette into a stable firing platform under conditions where wind, darkness, and danger blurred into a single, unforgiving equation. The recruits stood absolutely frozen as they watched her track the drone with unwavering focus, and even Hale, despite his stubborn pride, found himself unable to look away because something deep within him recognized the gathering force behind her posture, a truth he had tried to suppress all day. She adjusted the sight offset with a tiny motion of her wrist, compensating for the misalignment through sheer instinct rather than mechanical reliance, and the corporal realized with a jolt of awe that she wasn't fighting the rifle's flaws at all. She was absorbing them, adapting around them, and turning the sabotage into a calculation she understood better than anyone present. The drone zigzagged violently, climbing into a brutal angle no beginner could track, yet she followed its arc with a fluid steadiness that made the air feel unnervingly thin, as if the world itself recognized the gravity of the moment unfolding on the field. Her finger tightened on the trigger not with force, but with a controlled inevitability, a gesture honed through countless repetitions that belonged to a time and place she had never spoken of and had no intention of revealing. Yet her body remembered every detail as clearly as breath. The shot erupted with a sharper crack than the last, slicing through the space between her and the drone with a speed that felt almost visible, and the recruits held their breath as the bullet ascended toward the impossible target, suspended in the space between triumph and disbelief. For a long heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the drone jerked violently, sparks trailing behind as the round connected with its internal circuitry at the exact millisecond required to destabilize its trajectory, and the machine spiraled downward in a chaotic collapse that erupted into a burst of shattered pieces scattering across the sky like a fractured constellation. A wave of stunned silence washed over the field, deeper and heavier than before, as every soldier realized they had just witnessed something no recruit or even most instructors would dare attempt, let alone achieve with sabotaged equipment and the weight of open mockery pressing against their back. The corporal lowered his head slightly, overwhelmed by the clarity of the truth crashing into him, because her shot had not been an accident, a miracle, or a lucky guess. It had been a declaration made without words, a quiet revelation of skill no amount of concealment could completely hide anymore. Hale staggered forward, as if trying to argue with what he had seen, but his voice broke before any words formed, leaving him standing alone in the dust with the hollow realization that all of his efforts to expose her weakness had instead illuminated her strength with blinding certainty. She lowered the rifle again, with the same calm composure she had maintained all day. But this time the silence surrounding her was different, no longer hostile or mocking, but reverent, fearful, and awed, as if the entire platoon finally understood that they were not witnessing a trainee's lucky day but the flicker of a hidden legend stepping reluctantly into the light. The drone fragments drifted slowly to the ground as the wind quieted, and the woman turned away from the stunned faces without seeking approval or acknowledgement, walking with the controlled stillness of someone who had already said everything she needed to say through the language of precision and restraint. And in that moment, every soldier on the field understood one undeniable truth. They had been training beside someone whose story did not begin at Camp Archer, but whose past was now demanding to be seen. For several long seconds after the drone shattered into a cascading rain of metal fragments, the training field lay suspended in an eerie stillness that seemed to settle over every soldier like a weight they couldn't quite name, and even the wind hesitated, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile moment taking shape. The range officer remained frozen beside the now empty launching platform, his clipboard hanging loosely from his fingers as he stared at the drifting remnants with a confusion that quickly deepened into something closer to disbelief, because even he, despite years of watching recruits attempt impossible shots, had never witnessed precision executed with such calm inevitability. A wave of shock pulsed through the platoon in slow, rippling breaths as soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, each waiting for someone else to speak first. Yet no one dared break the silence because acknowledging what they'd seen meant admitting how profoundly wrong they had been about her since the moment she stepped onto the field. Several recruits tried to swallow their fear, but their throats tightened as they watched her lower the flawed rifle with the same quiet composure she always carried. And for the first time all day, none of them could find a single joke, insult, or excuse capable of drowning out the truth her actions had carved into the air. Sergeant Hale, who had spent every hour of the morning sculpting a narrative built on arrogance and disdain, felt the ground shift beneath him as a cold realization seeped into his chest, and he struggled to maintain his usual posture of authority even as doubt gnawed its way through the confidence he had once worn like armor. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue another command or salvage some fragment of pride, but the words never formed, collapsing before they reached his tongue, as he remained trapped in the undeniable reality that the woman he mocked could outshoot him with a sabotaged weapon and no visible effort. The corporal, still standing near the equipment rack, felt a tremor of clarity pulse through him as he watched her steady breathing and precise posture, and his earlier suspicions hardened into certainty that her presence at Camp Archer was not a mistake, coincidence, or administrative oversight, but part of a story buried beneath layers no ordinary soldier would ever be permitted to see. He remembered the specialized demonstrations he had once glimpsed during a joint force assignment years earlier, operatives who moved with that same disciplined grace, people whose files were covered in thick redactions, and whose eyes carried the weight of battles fought far from public records, and the memory sent a shiver down his spine. All around the field, recruits finally began to shift uneasily, as if waking from a collective trance, and their voices rose in scattered whispers filled with fear, awe, and disbelief, each one attempting to make sense of the impossible shot, but failing miserably because no explanation could reconcile their assumptions with the truth unfolding before them. "She hit the high-speed drone with a broken rifle," one trainee murmured, his voice cracking at the edges, and another replied in a hushed tone that even some instructors avoided attempting that target due to its brutal unpredictability, yet she had done it on her first try. The range officer finally regained enough composure to kneel beside the spent weapon, his fingers brushing the warped alignment and internal stress marks left by deliberate sabotage, and his expression hardened with a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration as he realized the rifle had been designed to fail under pressure. He looked up at her with a deep breath that trembled despite his best efforts to hide it, and for the first time since morning, he addressed her not as a struggling recruit or a liability, but as a soldier carrying a skill set that exceeded anything within his authority to categorize or control. "You shouldn't have been able to fire a second shot with this," he said quietly, though his voice carried across the silent field, and the recruits stiffened as they realized they were hearing an admission that none of them had been prepared to face. She simply nodded once, neither dismissing his astonishment nor accepting his praise, and her silence carried a weight heavier than any explanation she could have offered, because the truth behind her skill was not something she owed to anyone on that field, not now, and perhaps not ever. Hale took a step toward her, as if attempting to regain control, but the moment he reached her vicinity, he felt the quiet pressure of her presence push back against him, not through aggression or intimidation, but through an absence of fear so absolute it made the very air around her feel unnervingly steady. The recruits sensed it too, an unspoken boundary that none dared cross, and they stepped aside instinctively as she walked across the field, leaving a path of stunned silence in her wake, as though the ground itself acknowledged the shift in power that had just taken place. The corporal followed her with his eyes, noting the subtle precision in her stride, the controlled rise and fall of her breath, and the steady rhythm of someone who had spent years training for moments far more intense than this. And he felt a growing responsibility to understand not just who she was, but why she was here. Several trainees watched her with expressions caught between awe and fear, whispering that no one in their right mind attempted the final drone, much less succeeded, and their voices carried the unspoken truth that they were no longer dealing with an ordinary recruit, they were witnessing the emergence of something far more formidable. As she approached the far end of the field, the late afternoon sun cast a long shadow behind her, stretching across the dirt in a sharp, unmistakable silhouette that seemed to echo the truth none of them could ignore any longer. She walked like someone who had already endured more than this training base could ever demand. And as the platoon finally exhaled in a collective shudder, they realized the moment of silence that followed her shot had not simply been shock, it had been the breaking of a chain, the collapse of every illusion they had built around her. and the first step toward uncovering a truth none of them were prepared to face. As the woman continued walking toward the far edge of the field, the last fragments of the shattered drone settling across the dusty ground, a quiet murmur drifted from the back of the formation, carried on a trembling breath from a soldier who had remained silent all day, and his words sliced through the lingering shock with the weight of a forgotten memory. "That wasn't a recruit's shot," the older staff sergeant whispered, his voice low enough to sound like a confession, yet sharp enough for those nearby to freeze in place, because the tone he used held a gravity they had never heard from him before. His weathered face tightened as he stared at the woman's retreating figure, and the lines carved by years of service deepened around his eyes as recognition settled into his expression, not the uncertain kind born from assumptions, but the painful certainty of a man confronting something he once believed belonged only in stories whispered at the edges of classified briefings. One of the younger recruits beside him turned, confusion clouding his gaze, and asked what he meant, but the staff sergeant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if forcing himself to release a truth that had rested dormant in his memory for far longer than he cared to admit. "That technique," he finally muttered, keeping his eyes fixed on the woman's posture as she moved across the field. "I saw it once, years ago, during a joint training demonstration none of us were supposed to talk about afterward." "N?" The nearby recruits leaned in despite themselves, drawn to the tension quivering in his voice, and the staff sergeant continued speaking as though compelled by a force stronger than fear, revealing memories that had clung to him from a time when he stood far lower in rank and far more vulnerable to the awe he still felt now. "It was a classified unit," he said, each word measured by the weight of recollection. "Not the kind that wears patches or shows up in reports. They didn't fire like normal shooters. They didn't breathe like normal shooters. They read the air, calculated the recoil, adapted to broken gear as if it was part of the design." The corporal, standing only a few steps away, stiffened as those words aligned perfectly with the instincts that had been gnawing at him all day, and the knot of unease in his chest tightened into something colder, as he realized the staff sergeant had just confirmed the suspicion he hadn't dared speak aloud. The recruits exchanged bewildered glances, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet woman they had mocked, with the possibility that she carried a history none of them could comprehend, but the staff sergeant's expression left no room for doubt, only a stark, heavy truth he could no longer keep buried. "She didn't just adjust for the rifle's flaws," he continued, his voice roughened by memory. "She predicted them, compensated before the shot. Nobody does that unless they've been trained under conditions where equipment failure is assumed, not feared." He lifted a trembling hand and rubbed the back of his neck, as if trying to dispel a chill that had been absent moments earlier, and his gaze remained locked on her silhouette, moving steadily toward the tree line, each step revealing a depth of experience she clearly had never intended to show. A ripple of fear spread through the nearby recruits as they absorbed his words, and even the most arrogant among them found themselves stepping backward with the instinctive caution of soldiers who had just realized they had provoked someone far more dangerous than their pride allowed them to imagine. The staff sergeant's expression darkened further as he continued speaking, almost reluctantly. "There was a nickname," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "something the instructors used when they thought we couldn't hear. They called that unit ghost walkers, said they went places the rest of us never would." The corporal swallowed hard, and the air between the soldiers seemed to thicken as the words settled over them, a ghost of a legend they had never expected to encounter in a place as ordinary as Camp Archer, yet now stood undeniably before them in the form of a woman they had dismissed as weak. One recruit shook his head sharply and tried to laugh off the idea, but the sound died immediately in his throat when the staff sergeant continued, "I watched one of them take a shot through a storm of dust and debris, hit a moving target in the dark, using a weapon that barely fired clean, and she just did the same thing with a rifle someone sabotaged." "Oh." The truth in his voice shattered the last remnants of denial lingering among the recruits, and the field fell silent once more, not from shock this time, but from a dawning understanding that they had crossed paths with someone whose legend began long before this training cycle, a presence woven quietly into the fabric of operations they were never meant to know existed. As the woman reached the shadow of the pines, she paused only long enough to wipe a faint trace of powder from her sleeve, and though the gesture appeared small, it carried a final confirmation of the staff sergeant's whispered revelation, grounding his memories in a reality that none of them could escape now that it stood so clearly before their eyes. Hale, overhearing enough to grasp the implication, felt something cold and hollow open inside his chest as he realized the magnitude of his mistake, and the pride he had weaponized against her all day crumbled beneath the weight of a truth he had been too blind or too arrogant to see. The platoon remained unmoving as they watched her walk deeper into the tree line's shade, each soldier silently reckoning with the possibility that they had not simply underestimated a recruit, but inadvertently challenged a ghost from the classified edges of their own country's military history. And in that stillness, as the staff sergeant's whisper continued echoing through their minds, every one of them understood with a quiet dread that her reveal had only just begun, and the real story behind her presence at Camp Archer was far from finished. As the woman disappeared beneath the line of pines at the field's edge, the silence she left behind settled over the platoon like an unspoken verdict, pressing into their lungs with a weight that none of them could shake, no matter how many steady breaths they forced into their chests. The range officer remained locked in place, with the sabotage rifle still cradled in his hands, and although he tried to mask his growing discomfort behind a rigid posture, his eyes kept drifting toward the tree line with the wary respect of someone who recognized he had just witnessed a skill set existing far outside the jurisdiction of training rosters or performance charts. Recruits shuffled uneasily across the dirt, their earlier bravado replaced by a cold awareness that they had spent the entire day mocking a soldier whose silence held more stories than any of them could imagine, and the guilt that blossomed in their expressions carved deeper lines of uncertainty into their once confident faces. Sergeant Hale attempted to restore the familiar tone of authority by barking for the platoon to return to formation, yet the tremor in his voice betrayed the fear gnawing at his pride, and the recruits obeyed more out of habit than trust, unsure whether his orders carried meaning anymore, now that his judgment had been so completely undone. The older staff sergeant lingered near the equipment rack, staring at the empty path she had taken with a haunted look that suggested he was reliving moments from long before this day, moments filled with classified briefings, whispered rumors, and the rare glimpses he once caught of operators who moved like wraiths between worlds the rest of the military never saw. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a piece of the past he had never intended to revisit, and murmured that some ghosts were better left undisturbed, though the corporals and recruits around him understood instantly that the ghost in question was no longer a distant legend, but a living presence sharing their barracks and training grounds. As the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting fractured beams through the pines, the woman reappeared briefly at the forest's edge, her silhouette framed by drifting dust and golden light, and although she stood motionless for only a heartbeat, the quiet strength radiating from her made even the wind hesitate before brushing past her shoulders. She glanced back at the platoon with an expression that held neither triumph nor resentment, only a deep, tempered calm forged from experiences they could never name, and in that single look she seemed to acknowledge the shift that had taken place, not just in their perception of her, but in the trajectory of everything that would follow. Then she turned away again, disappearing into the shadows of the barracks path, with the steady composure of someone who had endured far harsher tests than the mockery of inexperienced soldiers, leaving behind a field tinged with the uneasy recognition that their world had just grown larger than they ever imagined. The range officer finally lowered the broken rifle, studying the warped components with a troubled frown, and he muttered under his breath that command would need to be notified, though even he seemed unsure how to explain a recruit who shot like a legend and moved like classified history returning for one final unfinished chapter. Across the formation, several recruits exchanged glances filled with the mixture of fear and reverence that follows the first glimpse of an unexpected truth, and although none of them dared to say it aloud, they all felt the same quiet certainty settling into their bones. The woman they had underestimated would not remain anonymous much longer. As the platoon was dismissed and scattered across the grounds, the corporals lingered for a moment longer, replaying every gesture, every breath, every impossible shot she had taken, and each man understood that the day's events had not exposed her weakness, but revealed the beginning of a story far larger than their own. And as the evening shadows stretched across Camp Archer like long, reaching fingers, one undeniable thought echoed through the mind of every soldier who had witnessed her precision, whatever her past was. It was coming back for her, and the quiet protector they had mocked was about to step into a light none of them could shield their eyes from.